A millionaire decided to help a beggar. He tossed the coins into the plastic cup in front of her without saying a word. As the coins clinked, a man walking by glanced at Ethan and muttered with disdain, "Don't waste your money. That one's a thief." The woman looked directly at the man and, in a calm and composed tone, replied, "People are so sure of who I am, but they don't even know themselves." Ethan Blake quickened his pace through the bustling streets of New York, eager to reach his car as quickly as possible. As usual, he was moving on autopilot. His mind was elsewhere. The meeting with investors had dragged on longer than expected, and he still needed to review contracts before bed. A typical workday, the same relentless rush as always, full of numbers, forecasts, and devoid of emotional distractions. As he turned a corner onto a dimly lit street, something made him slow down. A young woman was sitting on the ground, wearing worn-out clothes and holding a small handwritten sign, "I need help. Anything will do." She didn't seem to look directly at the passers-by. Her head was held high, but there was a rigidity in her posture, as if she were challenging the world even while asking for its compassion. Ethan never stopped to notice these situations, but as he felt some coins weighing in his wallet, he figured it made sense to help the beggar and lighten the burden in his pocket at the same time. He tossed the coins into the plastic cup in front of her without saying a word. As the coins clinked, a man walking by, a fellow in simple clothes and a worn-out hat, glanced at Ethan and muttered with disdain, "Don't waste your money. That one's a thief." The woman looked directly at the man and, in a calm and composed tone, replied, "People are so sure of who I am, but they don't even know themselves." Ethan was intrigued. He thought about simply walking away, as he normally would, but something about that phrase unsettled him. It didn't feel like a random remark. She was sharp, and it made him think. Ethan decided to ask, "And who are you then?" She raised an eyebrow, a small, cynical smile playing at the corner of her lips. Just another face in the crowd, each with their own story. Ethan didn't respond. He simply observed her for a moment longer than he intended, then turned and walked away, her words echoing in his mind. For some reason, he couldn't forget her. Later that night, back at home, surrounded by his papers and contracts, the image of the young woman kept coming back to him. Ethan tried to focus, but that phrase continued to haunt him. "People are so sure of who I am, but they don't even know themselves." He sighed and leaned back in his chair, an unexplainable discomfort growing inside him. After all, what did he really know about her? And why was it so hard to leave her behind, as he had done with so many other uncomfortable people and situations? Ethan woke up the next morning more tired than he had expected. He had spent hours trying to focus on contracts, but the image of the young woman from the night before lingered in his mind. He couldn't quite understand why it bothered him so much, perhaps because he truly didn't know himself, as she had mentioned. He had contacts, plenty of them. If he wanted to learn more about someone's life, all it took was a phone call. But the idea seemed absurd. He was a businessman with more important things to do. Why spend energy on a stranger? Yet, by late morning, driven by the urge to do something different, something that might teach him more not only about her but also about himself, he picked up his phone. The call was to Max Davis, an old friend who ran a private security firm. Max wasn't just efficient at discreet investigations, he was also someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions. "I need some information about a person," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "Always straight to the point, Blake," Max replied, laughing on the other end of the line. "Name? Address? What do you have?" "Nothing but an approximate location. Corner of 35th and 8th last night. A young woman begging. Should be an easy case." "Easy for you, maybe. I'll see what I can find," Max chuckled. "But you going to tell me why you're curious about a street girl?" "That's none of your business, Max. Just call me when you've got something." Ethan hung up before his friend could press further. He spent the rest of the day immersed in work, trying to ignore the anticipation of the call. When the phone finally rang, it was already evening. "I found what you were looking for," Max said, getting straight to the point. "Her name is Sarah Carter." Complicated story. Ethan grabbed a pen, ready to take notes. "I'm listening." Max paused, which was unusual for him. "Look, Ethan, I don't judge anyone. But her life hasn't been easy, and it shows in her records. Sarah was abandoned by her parents as a child. She was placed in foster care, but never stayed long in any home. At 17, she aged out of the system and tried to survive on her own. And after that?" Ethan asked, his voice more urgent than he intended. Minor offenses, petty thefts, nothing violent, but enough to make her suspect in most people's eyes. Looks like she tried to get jobs but always had trouble holding on to them. Ethan leaned back in his chair, processing the information. He felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite identify. On one hand, her history justified the distrust people had for her, like the man who had accused her the night before. On the other hand, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Abandonment, rejection, failed attempts to survive. Is that all? He asked, trying to sound indifferent. That's the gist of it. Nothing grand or shocking. Just a hard life, like so many others out there, man. Ethan thanked him and hung up. He sat there for a few minutes, staring into the distance. It wasn't exactly what he had expected to hear, but maybe it was exactly what he needed. Sarah wasn't a threat, but she wasn't just a victim either. She was someone who had fought a constant battle, always losing. That night, as he sipped his last glass of wine, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't entirely sure what he intended to do, but he felt he couldn't simply ignore what he had learned. He needed to act. The next day, Ethan picked up the phone again. This time, he called Tony Castellano, an old friend who owned a pizzeria in Brooklyn. Ethan and Tony had a good relationship, but Tony was a no-nonsense man who didn't tolerate slackers. "Tony, I need to ask you for a favor," Ethan began. "You asking for favors? This must be a special day." Tony joked on the other end of the line. "I'm serious. I need you to hire someone." "And why would I do that? Who is this person?" "A young woman. No experience, but I'm willing to cover any damages she might cause to your business." Tony was silent for a moment. "Are you? Well, that's great news because my last employees have been nothing but headaches. And honestly, Ethan, I'm tired of dealing with employee issues. You'd better know what you're getting me into." "Tony, I'll take full responsibility for her. Consider it a deal." Tony sighed. "Fine, send her over. But only because you've never asked me for anything before." Ethan hung up, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. He still didn't know how Sarah would react, but he was determined to try. Tomorrow, he would find her again, and this time he'd have something more than coins to offer. Ethan spotted Sarah sitting in the same spot as the night before, with the same crumpled sign in front of her. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked directly toward her, crouching so they were on eye level. Sarah looked at him with an unreadable expression, as if trying to understand why someone like him would return. "I have something for you," he began, pulling out a piece of paper with the address of the pizzeria. She raised an eyebrow, suspicious, but said nothing. "It's a job opportunity. A friend of mine, the owner of a pizzeria, is willing to give you a chance. You just need to show up for the interview." Sarah stared at the paper as though it might be some kind of trap before crossing her arms and letting out a short, humorless laugh. "Let me get this straight. You, a guy in a suit, spent the night thinking about something a beggar said and decided to change my life? Is that it?" Ethan held her gaze unwavering. He was prepared for resistance, but not for the blunt way she challenged him. "I saw potential in you," he said firmly. "I just want to give you a chance." Sarah shook her head, laughing again, but this time there was something softer in the gesture, as if she were trying to mask the confusion she felt. "And what if I fail?" she asked, almost as if daring Ethan to reconsider. "Does it become another story you tell in meetings? Oh, that one time I tried to help a poor girl, but she was hopeless." Ethan, unfazed, replied, "I don't care if you fail. I care if you don't try." Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes moving from the paper in her hand to Ethan's face. She seemed to weigh his words, searching for any sign of deceit or ulterior motive. She found nothing. "A job at a pizzeria, huh?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. "It's been a long time since anyone offered me anything that wasn't a lecture." She sighed, clutching the paper between her fingers. "Fine, I'll go. But if this is some kind of joke, I'll walk out before you even notice." "You won't have to," Ethan replied with a small smile. Sarah looked up at him one last time, still wary, but with a glimmer of something that seemed almost hope. Ethan stood, adjusting his coat. "Good luck, Sarah." Without waiting for a response, he walked away. As he moved down the street, he felt an unusual lightness, as if that simple gesture had changed something within him too. Deep down, he knew this chance was as much for her as it was for himself. The phone rang in the middle of the afternoon, interrupting Ethan's meeting with his managers. He glanced at the screen and saw Tony's name flashing. With a quick gesture, he excused himself and stepped out of the room, answering the call with a faint smile. "Tony," he started, trying to sound casual. "Calling to thank me already?" On the other end, Tony's laugh was thick with sarcasm. "Thank you?" "Not exactly." Ethan paused, sensing the more serious tone. "What happened?" "Sarah happened," Tony replied, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Look, Ethan, I agreed to this because I trust you, but she's making things difficult." Ethan pressed the phone tighter to his ear, keeping his composure. "Difficult how?" "First day, she dropped an entire tray of plates. This morning, she tripped over the mop bucket and spilled water all over the dining room. This afternoon, she tried to help at the register and got so flustered a customer almost walked out without paying." Ethan rubbed his eyes and exhaled slowly. "Is she trying at least?" Tony let out a huff. "If she weren't trying, and if I didn't have someone covering the damage, she'd already be out the door." "It takes time, Tony." "Sure it does. And broken plates take money," Tony said, his tone a mix of frustration and humor. "Don't forget our deal. You're covering the costs, remember?" Ethan allowed himself a small smile, even though he knew he probably shouldn't. "I remember. Send me the bill. And keep calling when it happens again. I'm committed to seeing this through." "Great," Tony replied dryly. "Give her more time, Tony. I know you can." When the call ended, Ethan stood still for a moment, staring out the window of his office. The gray New York sky seemed heavy, but he felt something different. Tony wasn't the type to waste time on someone who wasn't worth it. If he saw something in Sarah, then there was hope. Ethan knew that Sarah didn't just need a chance, she needed time. And he was willing to give her both. A few months later, Ethan barely remembered that he had helped the beggar, but in the late afternoon, the phone rang, interrupting him as he sifted through a pile of documents in his office. He picked up the phone without haste, more out of habit than curiosity. When he saw Tony's name flashing on the screen, his first thought was inevitable. It's been a while since he last called. More broken dishes? Here we go again. "Tony, how much is the damage this time?" On the other end, Tony laughed, a sound unexpected and full of humor. "Do you really think I only called to bill you?" "Relax, Blake. Today it's good news." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Tony hadn't called in months, and to be honest, he had almost forgotten about Sarah and that improvised act of generosity. "Good news? Are you sure about that?" he replied, trying to mask his skepticism. "Absolutely," Tony confirmed. "I thought you'd like to know that Sarah's been promoted." There was silence on Ethan's end. He furrowed his brow as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Promoted? That's right, Ethan. She's the new manager of the pizzeria." Ethan blinked, confused. He remembered the earlier calls, full of complaints about dropped trays and bills for broken dishes. The idea of Sarah, the clumsy girl, being promoted seemed surreal. "You're joking, right? How did that happen?" Tony chuckled again, but his tone turned more serious as he replied. "At first, I didn't think she'd last a week. She made mistakes all the time. Dropped things, messed up at the register, almost kicked a customer out by accident. But, Ethan, she never gave up. And that's something you can't teach." Ethan listened in silence as Tony continued. "Sarah learned over time. The more she fell, the faster she got back up. And let me tell you, the customers love her. The staff does too. They see how hard she works, and it's inspired everyone." Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He hadn't expected this outcome, not even remotely. And she accepted? The promotion, I mean. "She did, but not without hesitation," Tony said, his voice carrying a barely disguised sense of pride. "At first, she thought I was joking. Then she thanked me like I'd handed her a golden ticket. It was moving, man." Ethan leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. He had never expected big results when he decided to help her. To him, it was just an attempt, perhaps more out of curiosity than true generosity. But hearing that Sarah had managed to turn that chance into something real was surprising. "She deserves it," Ethan said after a long pause. "Agreed. And you know what's interesting? She asked me to thank you. She said she wouldn't be here if you hadn't pushed for her. She did it all herself, Tony. I just gave her a little nudge." Tony chuckled softly. "Maybe, But sometimes that's exactly what people need. When the call ended, Ethan sat for a few moments, staring at the phone in his hand. Tony was right. Sometimes all someone needs is a chance, but what Sarah had done with hers was beyond anything Ethan had expected. He stood and walked to the window. From his office high above, he looked out over New York, a sea of lights and shadows stretching far below. The memory of Sarah on the sidewalk returned to his mind, but now the image was no longer of a girl with a sign. He pictured her as Tony had described, confident, determined, leading a team. People are so sure of who I am, but they don't even know themselves. Ethan let out a faint smile. Maybe he thought Sarah wasn't the only one who had changed through this story. At night, while enjoying a fine wine and letting himself get lost in his thoughts, the intercom of his penthouse buzzed. "Mr. Blake." The doorman's neutral voice came through. "A delivery person is here with a pizza." Ethan frowned. He hadn't ordered anything. "Pizza? Must be a mistake." "No, sir. It's in your name. Should I send it up?" Still puzzled, Ethan agreed. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, a young delivery man stood there holding a pizza box and smiling politely. "Special delivery from Castellano's Pizzeria," said the young man as he handed over the box. Ethan thanked him, closed the door, and carried the box to his table. As he opened it, he noticed something unusual, a carefully folded note tucked inside the lid. He picked it up and unfolded it with care. The handwriting was simple but steady, and the words immediately captured his full attention. "Ethan, you may not fully know yourself yet, but the little I've seen of you is enough to know you have a huge heart. You've changed my life. I hope the pizza is worthy of the gratitude I feel for you. Sarah." Ethan read the note more than once, each word resonating more deeply than he had expected. He rested his hands on the table, staring at the paper for several long moments. He tried not to think too hard about what he was feeling. A mix of quiet pride, surprise, and something he couldn't quite name. It was rare for him to do something purely altruistic, and knowing that such a simple gesture, a phone call, a little push, had resulted in something so meaningful was both unsettling and profoundly gratifying. He glanced at the pizza, noticing how perfectly it had been prepared. It was almost as if it carried the same care that Sarah now seemed to pour into everything she did. He took a slice and smiled, more to himself than for any other reason. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he didn't know himself as well as he thought. But one thing was undeniable. In that moment, he felt a little more complete.
Hey, what did you think of the story? Everyone deserves a chance, right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which country or state you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.